Okay, so this is the Bible study for Matthew 17, verses 22 through 27. And the text says, "When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, 'The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life.' And the disciples were filled with grief. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, 'Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?' 'Yes, he does,' he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. 'What do you think, Simon?' he asked. 'From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others?' 'From others,' Peter answered. 'Then the children are exempt,' Jesus said to him. 'But so that you may not cause offense, so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and for yours.'" All right, so remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us. And number one says, what did we talk about in the last Bible study in Matthew 17:14 through 21? A, Jesus came down the mountain and met a crowd of people. That's true after the Mount of Transfiguration. B, a man came to Jesus and asked him to have mercy on his son. That's true. C, he brought the boy to the disciples, but they were unable to heal him. Yes, that happened sort of before we encounter this man, and he tells Jesus that that had happened. D, the disciples ask why they couldn't drive out this demon. And then E, Jesus said that they had too little faith. That says faith. They probably had plenty of faith, not faith. And this one only comes out with prayer. Too little faith. That's a funny typo. I don't know how that happened. Number two. So I mean, we've already studied this. I don't need to rehearse it. It's one of my favorite texts. Not just the Mount of Transfiguration, but what happens when they come down the mountain and they are confronted with. So I like to say, up on the mountain, the reason they had to come down that Peter didn't understand was because of mission. When they got to the bottom, they were faced with mission and honestly the difficulty of ministry. And I would say that this is when I get away with God, whether it's to family camp or some other kind of prayer retreat or some kind of a conference where I come back really pumped up and ready to do ministry because God's spoken to me and I've been encouraged and all this stuff, and almost always I'm hit with the reality of ministry right when I come back with how hard ministry is, the difficult situations of ministry. I'm almost afraid to go away because what I come back to, and that's been sort of the case over the course um, of my ministry. Now I'll say that we have wonderful folks in our church, and so in a lot of cases we have leaders that have. So it used to be that people would sort of leave things undone to wait for me to deal with it when I came back, and I don't think that that happens anymore, and I'm thankful for that. Um, but that being said, the reality of ministry is still there. So I'll be pumped. I came back from family camp this year, and I was pumped up, and there were difficult situations that I was met with when I got back, and that's the reality of ministry. Anyway, that's so I usually I love to teach those texts together because we probably need to understand them together and as a balanced perspective of ministry. So, number two, what is happening now in 17, 22, and 23? A, Jesus told them that the Son of Man is going to be delivered in the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day will be raised to life. That's true. That happened. This is not the first time he's told them that. In fact, in my NIV version, the sort of title over that section of verses says Jesus predicts his death a second time. So it's the second time we've read about it. We don't know if it's the second time he's said it or if this has been an ongoing thing. Um, but he told them, and then B, the disciples were filled with grief. Now, it's interesting because he says, and on the third day will be raised to life, but the disciples were filled with grief as if that part wasn't in there. And maybe it's because when he said it, the death part computes, but the raised to life on the third day part doesn't compute. We don't see that happening. That's not a normal thing. So perhaps they were assuming that was sort of a spiritual resurrection and not a physical resurrection, or some kind of a it almost seems like they thought this was like, oh, he's in a better place. And you're like, I'm going to die, but it's cool because on the third day I'm going to be raised to life and I'll be in a better place. And if anybody's been told that when they're grieving somebody who has passed, um, I don't know, depending on where you're at in your grief, you either want to yell at them, punch them, walk away from them, never talk to them again. It's probably not comforting. It, don't say that to somebody. Don't ever say that that person is in a better place, even if it's true, because it is not comforting when somebody is grieving. Um, if they say it, if the person that's grieving says it, that's okay. They're trying to convince themselves and come to terms um, with it being okay. But you're not going to make it okay by saying that. Um, and even worse, don't ever say God needed them more than you did, because that's like not even theologically correct. That's just stupid. So if you've ever said those, you can't change it now, but pray and ask God to give you better wisdom in the future. Because I'm learning a lot about grief and grieving, not only through my own grief and grieving, but also through working with hospice and working with people who are grieving all the time. So, um, church people are kind of the worst at trying to make somebody stop crying by saying, you know, repeating trite phrases that don't actually help. So, even if they're true, even if they're true, which I hope they're in a better place is a true statement, but it's not helpful. So number three, what happened next in 1724 through 25a? Uh, Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum. Yeah, it starts out and says after Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum. So this all happens after they arrived in Capernaum. B, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" So they're trying to find something to trap Jesus in, trying to point out something where he's falling short, because he is saying things that convict them. That's what's going on here. And then C, Peter instinctively answered, "Yes, he does," in defense of his teacher. So I don't know if you've ever done that, where there was a time when I said something to somebody and I shouldn't have said it, and I met with the leaders and said, "Hey, this is what I said. This is what I did. I know I shouldn't have said it. I've repented. I don't want to say that kind of thing again. But hey, if somebody comes up and says Pastor Pete said this," I said, "Don't defend me. I think you're going to be tempted to defend me." There are some people that um, thankfully, there are a lot of people in the church that love me, and even then, there were people that loved me and would defend me. Um, I'm not without flaw. So defend me if somebody says that I did something that's totally out of character. You don't have to defend me if I do something that is probably the kind of thing I would have done. you can come and say, hey, uh, there's some folks saying this. I don't know if you did this or not, but you might want to address this. That's okay. I'll take that. But you don't have to defend me. So it's kind of like Peter is defending Jesus because surely Jesus would have done the right thing, and we know it's right to pay the temple tax. So he's like, yeah, Jesus did the right thing. He always does the right thing. He pays the temple tax. But it's funny because what happens next makes him realize, I think, that he spoke out of turn. So number 4 says, what happened after Peter answered like this, according to 17:25b through 27. A, Peter came into the house, or all of them did, but perhaps Peter was the last one because he was caught up in this conversation with the hecklers that didn't seem uh, that didn't seem to cause Jesus enough to concern to stop. So it kind of seems like they entered town. I don't know if they went to the temple first or whatever. Well, the temple's not in. Anyway, um, I don't know what they did, when they came into Capernaum, but they're going into this house and they're in the streets, and somebody says, hey, doesn't your teacher pay that? We haven't seen him around paying the tax. We haven't got anything from him. What's going on here? And Peter, um, whether he was last in the party or whether he just sort of stopped and was the one that had to stop and answer the question. Did they address Peter directly or were they addressing all the disciples, but some of them just kept their head down and ignored? But I'm just imagining this scene, and Peter, being the outspoken one, stops and addresses it, and he says, "Yes, he does." And somehow Jesus and the rest of the disciples continued on, and it says when Peter got into the house, so apparently they got into the house first, and Peter was sort of held up by this conversation and got into the house last. And when he got into the house, everybody's looking at him. It doesn't say that. That's my paraphrase. That's my imagination. But when he got in the house, it says Jesus was the first to speak. In other words, none of them were speaking. And Peter walked in, and everybody's quiet, and he's like, "Uh-oh, what I do now?" Because he stopped to address this, and by the time he caught up, there was something going on in Jesus's mind. He had to address something. So everybody was quiet, and Jesus is the first to speak. So that's what B says. Jesus was the first to speak. C, Jesus says, "What do you think, Simon?" Uh-oh. Peter must have spoken without thinking again. So Jesus is asking Peter to think, asking Peter to consider. And so he says, "What do you think?" Not only that, he calls him Simon. So by this point, Jesus has said, "I say that you are Peter," right? We read that text. At this point, the author, Matthew, is calling him Peter, but Jesus addressed him as Simon. That's probably not a good sign either. D, Jesus asked, "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or for others? From others." So in other words, he's saying, okay, if a king charges his kingdom taxes for the upkeep of the city or the kingdom, the palace, whatever, does he collect it from his children? Well, no. I mean, this may not be true today, but in that day, basically the children of the king didn't own anything. Everything they owned would belong to the king. They wouldn't own anything till the king died, and then it all became theirs. They were heirs of the tax that was being collected. It was coming to them, not from them. So Peter answered the obvious, from others. Kings don't charge their children tax. Their children are the heirs of the tax that is collected. So that's true. I did a little bit of study on the temple tax. The temple tax was for the upkeep of the temple. Each person, this is not like a tithe because each person paid an equal amount, not a percentage. So everybody that used the temple paid the same amount, essentially. Um, and it was probably a small amount, relatively, for some people. For some people, it's probably very expensive, but it was a set amount, and the priests did not pay the tax. The priests are the ones that keep up the temple, and therefore everybody else that pays it in, and the priests then use it as um, to keep up the temple and to do their work. So Jesus is making an argument, one, that he is a priest. But in a more logical argument, he's making the argument that he's a child of the king. Everything that goes to the temple really belongs to the king, and he is the child of the king, and therefore doesn't owe this tax. So Peter already said, yeah, my teacher pays it, because if he was just a teacher, if he was just a rabbi, he would pay it. If he was a priest, he would not. If he's a child of the king, as Jesus argued, he would not. So he's pointing out that he really doesn't feel the need. He doesn't feel like he would be sinful or wrong if he didn't pay the tax. Now, Peter defended him because Peter thought, well, surely he would be sinful or wrong if he didn't pay the tax. But Jesus is saying, I don't feel like it would be wrong. And I want you to reason with me excuse me, and understand why I don't think it would be wrong. Um, so number 5 says, so why was Peter wrong this time? He was wrong because he wasn't thinking about who Jesus is. He was thinking from earthly terms. They said, your teacher. He was thinking as a rabbi. But Peter was the one that said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So Peter was the one that declared this. So Peter knew it and yet shifted to the narrative that the people who were asking him the question were presenting. As a teacher, shouldn't he pay? And Peter said, yeah. But Peter was wrong because he was still thinking of Jesus as a teacher and not as the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Um, Number 6. So what did Jesus do according to 1727? A. Jesus made a plan to pay the tax despite the theological argument for not actually owing it in order to not cause offense, it says. That we may not cause offense, which that's also spelled wrong. In order to not cause offense, he said, we're going to pay it. In other words, in order to not make you a liar, Peter, maybe if they had asked me, then I would have explained to them why I don't owe it, and we could have had a theological discussion. But since you quickly answered without thinking and said yes, I'm not going to push this issue. And I'm just going to pay it. I Was it wrong for him to pay the tax? See, there's another question. Um, so I think that sometimes we find ourselves, we find ourselves defending ourselves, um, and saying, "Well, I shouldn't have to pay this," and maybe you're right. But also, what could you accomplish by just paying it versus not paying it? And And so Jesus decides not to cause offense, not to make Peter out to be a liar, to just he's sort of picking his battles, isn't he? Because it's not necessarily wrong for him to pay it either. Um, So Jesus sent Peter fishing. Whenever Peter goes fishing, it seems to be symbolic. So there's probably something to this. So I'll say this: whenever we have a story of Peter fishing, one of two things is happening. Either Jesus is about to show how he is sovereign, and Peter doesn't have as much control as he likes to think he does, or Peter is going back to his old way of life, and it's sort of symbolic of his old way of life. So I would argue that in many cases it's both. Um, So, when Jesus met Peter, we find them not being able to gather in all the fish because Jesus says, throw out your nets on the other side of the boat. They've been fishing all night in their own strength, but Jesus says, do something illogical, throw out on the other side of the boat. And they had such a catch that they had to go get their friends to help haul it in. And so this is the same sort of situation. It's almost as if Jesus sends Peter back to where they met and says, "Go back and go fishing and remember how I provided for you from the very beginning." So it's almost like he needs to represent this. When Peter went back and did his own thing after Jesus died on the cross, Jesus had to go get him because he had returned to what he knew, what he understood, what he could control, what he could do on his own. Um, that was of his own accord. This is because Jesus sent him. Jesus is sending him back to remind him. So it seems like sort of this. It doesn't see. I think we skip over this and focus on the fish with the coin in its mouth, and that's a pretty big deal. But I think understanding that Jesus sends him back to where they met, essentially, and says, "Go back and go fishing, and remember how I provided for you, and how I'm going to provide for you again." Um, because he sort of needs to retrain his mind, because he's thinking of him the way he did before, not the way he has come to know him. Um, See, Jesus provides for the text through a miraculous catch. I use that term on purpose because that's, I think a header on that text that I was just talking about in the NIV Bible. When was the last time you caught a fish with a coin in its mouth? I guess it's possible the fish ate something. You got a fish in a one of those coin ponds or something, wishing ponds or whatever. But generally, like it doesn't just have it right there in its mouth. Um, but there it was. What should we? Number 7 says, "What should we learn from this?" Um, Jesus is trying to remind Peter that he's more than what Peter thinks he is. So when Peter thinks that he should just go ahead and pay the tax, Jesus says, "We'll pay the tax. That's fine. That's not the point here. The point here is, do you remember who I am? You said it. Do you remember what I can do? Do you remember that I'm more than just a teacher?" Let's go back to the beginning. Um, what should we learn from this? We can learn about God's provision. Again, we can learn that um, we can learn that Jesus is declaring again that he's a child of the King. He's not the one that should be paying the tax. But also, I think it doesn't hurt us to remember that Jesus did things he wasn't trying to cause offense. In fact, in some cases, he very clearly said, "We're going to do this not to cause offense." So he wasn't causing offense. Like some Christians, I'm convinced they think everybody's against them, so they're justified in causing offense wherever they go. Sometimes Jesus did things in order to not cause offense. Did he offend people sometimes when he told them the truth? Certainly. That's something that we can learn. But some people like to offend people and then they justify themselves by saying, well, Jesus offended people when he told them the truth too. Well, I got in trouble one time because I said, you're not being like Jesus, you're just a butthole. And some people in the church didn't like that I said butthole. So I won't say that this time. But some people are trying to justify themselves by saying, see, I'm just like Jesus. He caused offense too, but you're not offending people because of the truth. You're offending people because of your own selfish pride. You're offending people because you're a jerk. Stop being a jerk. Jesus intentionally did not offend people when it wasn't necessary, when it wasn't helpful, when it didn't push forward the kingdom of God. And so he chose his moments when it was appropriate to bring offense, because that offense was caused by the truth of God. And he chose other moments not to cause offense because it wouldn't have moved the kingdom of God forward here on earth. And so I think it's worth learning that. Um, but I think the biggest thing, too, is Peter's still speaking quickly before he thinks. And perhaps we're doing that too. We're answering questions before we consider, and and what that tells people about us and about what we really believe and really understand at this point about God is sometimes a little scary. So we probably ought to. The Scripture says, "Be quick to listen and slow to speak." And I need to hear that message as much as anybody else. I can tell you that. Um, but there's a lot to learn in this text.